Discernment Digest seeks to take issues of the day and analyze those in a way that models discernment. So each episode begins with a digest, taking one or more current events to illustrate the practice of this most important but too often neglected discipline. If you want to know what discernment is and so how it's being practiced in this podcast, I urge you to listen to the first few episodes as all of them have been archived. This week, I'm taking just one issue from the news, while last week it was four. And covering this single issue is all I'm going to do in this podcast, as I think it raises some important matters for our consideration. So I'll devote the time entirely to it, and will anticipate picking up next time with the history of how conservative Christians have arrived where we are religiously, culturally, and politically. I said 2 weeks ago that sometime I would talk about how Richard Nixon had more respect for our system than some of what we have seen in the last few years. Now, that's quite a claim, but the facts surrounding his resignation in disgrace in August of '74 compared to where we are today, I think actually bear that out. And this is a good time to discuss it because this past week saw the passing of Alexander Butterfield at the age of 99. So who is Alexander Butterfield, and what does he have to do with Nixon? Well, even people alive in the 70s when Nixon was president did not know who Butterfield was until he was interviewed by investigators looking into what became known as the Watergate scandal, named for the Watergate office complex in D.C. that was broken into in 1972 during the presidential campaign of that year. Now, stay with me as I remind us regarding Watergate. Nixon was reelected president in a true landslide victory in 1972, winning 49 of 50 states against George McGovern. The only state McGovern carried was Massachusetts, which meant he did not even win his own home state of South Dakota, and it shows you just how very liberal Massachusetts is. Anyway, despite really no competition from the Democrats that year, Nixon was a somewhat paranoid guy, in part because he had run for president before. In 1960, and he had lost to John F. Kennedy in an extremely close election, an election with many questions about the voting in Democrat strongholds, like Mayor Richard Daley's Chicago, and whether even dead people had voted for Kennedy. Nixon was urged to demand a recount, but he conceded to Kennedy, though remaining bitter about the loss and, as well, his treatment by the press, who fawned over Kennedy's good looks and his stylish wife, Jacqueline. Kennedy benefited from their one-on-one debate that was the first ever that had been televised, and television was important because Kennedy just looked better on camera. If folks listened to the debate on radio, most thought that Nixon won. But if they watched on television, they thought Kennedy had won. And by the way, one reason this is an audio and not video podcast is I have something in common with Nixon, and that is a face made for radio. Now, after losing the presidential election that year, Nixon went back to his native California, and he ran for governor in '62, where he lost there, said he was just going to step out of the public eye, and he told the press there famously, "And you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." Most thought that was the end of Nixon's political career, and he did lay low in California in the mid-'60s before emerging to run and win the presidency in '68, and now he had won again in '72 in overwhelming fashion. But as I said, he was a bit paranoid, as was apparently his political team, and the political team known as the Committee to Re-elect the President. Now, that's a name that results in one of the more unfortunate-sounding acronyms in political history, CREEP. CREEP undertook to break into offices at the Watergate, in particular the offices that were used as the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, in order to plant cameras and listening devices and to spy on them. Now, whether Nixon knew about this is unproven, but as we will see, he did know and participate in the cover-up once it was discovered. And we have Alexander Butterfield, the guy who died this week, to thank for that. So stay with me. So CREEP hires some Cuban guys to break into the Watergate, but they get caught and are arrested. The Watergate scandal that ultimately brought down a president began to unravel with this incident. The break-in occurred in the wee hours of June 17, 1972, and the very next day, the White House press secretary was asked about it. Now, why would a reporter ask the White House about a break-in by 5 Cubans the day before? Well, for one, it was odd as these guys who could barely speak English were dressed in suits. But most important, as they were being processed after arrest by the D.C. police, among their possessions were address books containing the names and phone numbers of people associated with none other than Creep. And it was quite strange that these men would have the personal information of political aides to the President of the United States. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler denied the White House knew anything about it. He dismissed it as a, quote, third-rate burglary. But the connection between the burglars and Creep launched a search for the truth, first by the press and then later by Congress and the Department of Justice. And that took over 26 months, over 2 years from the time of the break-in to Nixon's resignation on August 9, 1974. Now, in those 26 months, the Washington Post became must-reading for many because their intrepid reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were publishing details that were moving closer and closer to the White House. Woodward and Bernstein were getting some of their information from a secret informant that they called Deep Throat, whose true identity was only made known in May of 2015 when Mark Felt, who was the former number 2 man with the FBI, was outed with his permission as, in fact, Deep Throat. That was Woodward and Bernstein's source. As the scandal deepened and widened, Congress could not ignore it politically, and of course the Democrats did not want to ignore it, as Nixon was a Republican, and this offered a chance to damage the Republican Party at a minimum. They began televised hearings in the Senate in May of 1973. And I recall watching those as an 11-year-old with my father who, like much of the nation, was fascinated and troubled by those hearings. The Watergate years were filled with investigations, not only by Congress, but by the FBI and a special prosecutor who was appointed by the Attorney General. The special prosecutor was a man named Archibald Cox. He was appointed in May of 1973, but was only able to serve until October of that year, so only 5 months. The reason for the short tenure is what is called the Saturday Night Massacre, and that refers to October 20 of 1973, when 3 high officials in the Department of Justice left office on that same evening. 2 resigned, 1 was fired. President Nixon wanted Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, he wanted him fired, which was controversial in the extreme since a special prosecutor is appointed precisely because he or she can have independence from political oversight and avoid the conflict of interest that the Department of Justice officials might have with investigating a president who appointed many of them. So the Attorney General appointed Cox, but Nixon wanted Cox removed as he was getting too close to the White House, even in his brief investigation. But the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, resigned in protest. So Nixon ordered the next in charge to fire Cox, but William Ruckelshaus likewise resigned rather than fire Cox. It then came to the third in charge, a man who would become famous about 15 years later when Ronald Reagan selected him for a seat on the Supreme Court. Robert Bork did fire Cox, and that issue came up in his Senate confirmation hearing for the Supreme Court and was in part responsible for his rejection by the Senate. A couple weeks later, Bork, who was then serving as acting Attorney General, appointed Leon Jaworski to serve as the replacement for Cox as special prosecutor. Now, both Nixon and Bork thought Jaworski would be better for Nixon and his people, but that turned out not to be the case. So what had upset Nixon so much that he insisted that Archibald Cox be fired? It was the revelation that a taping system existed in the Oval Office. And that is where the man who died this past week, Alexander Butterfield, comes in. As I said at the beginning, few Americans knew who Butterfield was. He had been a White House deputy chief of staff at one point, but at the time that he suddenly became famous, he was doing an unrelated job as head of the Federal Aviation Administration. But because he had worked in the White House, he was interviewed by investigators. And during an interview, he revealed for the first time that the president had a voice-activated taping system in his office. A few days later, he testified to that before the nation at the Senate Watergate committee, and everyone was stunned. Now, that was on July 16 of 73. A week later, Archibald Cox demanded Nixon hand over the tapes for his investigation, but Nixon refused the subpoena, claiming executive privilege. It went to court, and in October of 73, a federal appeals court rejected Nixon's executive privilege claim and said he had to honor Cox's subpoena and turn over the tapes. Next, Nixon proposed an almost comical compromise to Archibald Cox. He suggested that Senator John Stennis, who was a staunch supporter of Nixon, but importantly, he was a guy known to be hard of hearing. But Nixon proposed that Stennis listen to the tapes, and Stennis could provide summaries of them to Cox. Well, to no one's surprise, Cox immediately rejected it, and the next day was the aforementioned Saturday Night Massacre. Now, Nixon appealed the federal court's denial of his executive privilege claim to the Supreme Court. On July 24 of 74, the court ruled unanimously that Nixon must turn over the tapes, and just over 2 weeks later, he was no longer president, resigning on August 9th of that year. Now, okay, that's all quite sordid, and there's more, but I claimed at the beginning that Nixon had more respect for our system than some of what we've seen in the last few years. So how is that? Well, in two ways. The first is that the fact that for all of his unseemly and possibly illegal actions, in all of the interrogations to which his aides were subject, Nixon never pardoned any of them. None. Now, think about it. Our Constitution gives the president the power to pardon anyone for literally anything. For someone who has been already convicted and is in jail, he can commute their sentence. None of this is reviewable by Congress or the courts. It's a power that belongs to the president alone. In my lifetime, prior to Biden and Trump, there have been only two pardons that were controversial, as I recall. One was at the end of Bill Clinton's second term when he pardoned a friend and financial donor named Mark Rich. He did this on the last day in office as president, but it was controversial because Rich was a financial backer, so it looked like a quid pro quo, but also because the White House Office of Pardons had recommended against it, against issuing that pardon, and presidents nearly always follow those recommendations. Now, the other controversial pardon was Gerald Ford's pardon of Nixon himself after Ford, who was Nixon's vice president, became the president. 30 days later, he pardoned Nixon. Now, we don't know what crimes Nixon may have committed because Ford pardoned him before it could be taken to court. At the time, it was hugely controversial. But over time, history has judged Ford's decision more favorably as the country had been through over 2 years of turmoil with Watergate and so much other things going on in the nation and the world, and this brought at least that chapter to an end. So although presidents have this awesome power, it's rarely been abused, and extremely rarely been used for personal benefit, which was, as I said, what made the Clinton pardon so controversial. But our last two presidents have abused the pardon power in unprecedented ways. Biden issued a slew of pardons in his final days in office, including for his own son Hunter, when he had denied for years that he would do such a thing. Hunter would most definitely have been prosecuted by the incoming Trump administration, which is why Biden issued the pardon, to protect him. But that's not what the pardon power is for, to protect your friends and family. Now, whether Hunter would have been found guilty, I do not know, but I would like to have seen him face the law, have his day in court like all other Americans. I suspect nearly all of my listeners agree with that Hunter should have been prosecuted rather than pardoned, because almost all of us, if not all of us, are conservative. We didn't vote for Biden and we're not Democrats. So, okay, but what about Trump and pardons? Last month, the libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, posted a blog titled, "President Trump's Pardons, an Embarrassment of Riches." It starts by saying, Joe Biden granted 80 pardons in his 4-year term, but Trump's pardons make his predecessors look like a drop in the bucket. In the first year of the second Trump administration, the president issued 166 individual pardons, as well as a mass pardon that erased the verdicts of more than 1,500 January 6 Capitol rioters. And by the way, that included all of them, including the ones who attacked police officers. Cato Institute goes on to say, in other words, even putting aside the rioters' collective pardon, Trump is now issuing pardons at 8 times the rate Biden did. Nonetheless, the fact that a president issues more pardons than his predecessors is not necessarily problematic. The real problem lies in the great number of particular second-term pardons that appear indefensible. And they say such pardons fall into 5 categories, and then they list those. Biden's pardons eliminated roughly $680,000 in financial penalties. That's fines, restitution, forfeitures that were owed to the government. In contrast, it's been calculated that Trump's second-term pardons have forgiven criminal debts of more than $1.5 billion. This staggering sum, composed of money owed to crime victims and to government treasuries, has been zeroed out by presidential edict. Secondly, they say Trump has normalized the pardoning of disgraced politicians, and then they list several. He's not in their list, but since my listeners are mostly exclusively in Southeast Michigan, you might be interested to know that Trump pardoned former Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick for some reason. Third, they say Trump's pardons are beginning to undermine the contemporaneous work of his own Department of Justice. Alina Habba, Trump's own U.S. attorney in New Jersey, announced the 3-year sentence of a man for $38 million in tax fraud in April. But Trump pardoned him 7 months later. And they cite other examples. Fourth, and this is where it becomes especially corrupt, the article says, several features of Trump's pardons set off alarm bells for self-corruption, either of the president or of his associates. For instance, the ordinary vetting procedures of the Office of the Pardon Attorney have often been sidestepped. Formality in pardon deliberation is desirable because it immunizes the president from the appearance of pay to play. The absence of such formality makes it plausible that a multitude of recent pardons are transactional. Trump, for example, pardoned Paul Walczak, who evaded millions of dollars in taxes after Walczak's mother raised millions of dollars for MAGA candidates and paid $1 million to dine with the president at Mar-a-Lago. And it goes on. Before Trump pardoned, and I can't pronounce the name, Xiaoping Zhao, who headed the cryptocurrency exchange Binance while it fostered more than 1.5 million illegal virtual trades, as well as prohibited transactions to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS, and Hamas, Zhao had brokered a $2 billion investment in Eric and Donald Trump Jr.'s cryptocurrency business called World Liberty Financial. Now, when asked about Zhao in a subsequent 60 Minutes interview, Trump explained, "I have no idea who he is. I was told that he was a victim just like I was, and just like many other people, of a vicious, horrible group of people in the Biden administration." Another Trump pardon recently immunized Texas Congressman Henry Cuellar, a Democrat, and his wife from prosecution for receipt of bribes. Now, Trump evidently hoped that Cuellar would return the favor by switching parties to the grand old party, the Republican Party. But when that didn't happen, the president released an angry statement on Truth Social criticizing Cuellar for, quote, such a lack of loyalty in all caps, something that Texas voters and Henry's daughters will not like. Oh, well, next time, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Now, previous presidents would surely take offense at the suggestion that a pardon could be traded for something of value. Trump took offense, apparently, because Cuellar didn't hold up his end of the trade. And then fifth, here's another occasion for alarm bells. Donald Trump has increasingly focused on providing pardons to his campaign supporters who stretched or broke the law, people like John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis. And as the president's pardon attorney Ed Martin famously quipped on X, "No MAGA left behind." I would add, that's the end of the Cato blog, I would add that friends of Trump have gone to jail rather than testify against him, and he's awarded their loyalty with pardons or commutations, including Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and Steve Bannon. And here's what I want you to consider. Why didn't Nixon do that? Why didn't Nixon tell aides who went to jail, people like Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, John Mitchell, John Dean, and many others, don't cooperate at all with Congress or the FBI. You'll be convicted. You'll possibly go to jail, but I'll commute or pardon you. Commute your sentence or pardon you. One possible reason that he didn't do that is that he would have been impeached and removed from office had he done so. That's how unheard of it was at the time. But Trump has no fear from this Congress, and he can pardon at will without any accountability. Now, it's always been true that all presidents have had this power, but it's taken 250 years to have a president who used it in this way. Not only did Nixon not use the pardon power to his personal advantage, he also did not obstruct justice when the tapes were ordered to be turned over by the Supreme Court. So think about that. What if he didn't turn them over? The Supreme Court doesn't have any kind of military arm or police arm to go and demand them. Really is unclear what would have happened. But he turned them over. And this despite being advised by aides like Pat Buchanan to burn the tapes that have anything incriminating on them. He obviously didn't do that. He didn't have anyone else do that with the promise of a pardon for that person. Now, does anyone remember the classified documents case from President Trump's first term? He was accused of not only possessing and keeping and storing classified documents after they had been subpoenaed, but also of obstructing justice by moving and hiding them from his own lawyers and from investigators. Now, this is all in Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's report, which you can download on the internet. When Trump won re-election to a second term, his Justice Department shut down the investigation. Now, like the Hunter Biden case, I do not know whether President Trump would have been found guilty had he gone to trial, but I would have liked to have seen him have his day and make his case in court and face the law like the rest of us. Now, with regard to those tapes, and Alexander Butterfield, who passed away this past week, revealing the existence of those tapes, what really demanded that Nixon resign after the Supreme Court said, you must turn these over. If he wasn't going to destroy the tapes, then he knew that those were going to incriminate him, and he knew that for this reason. During the summer of '73, in the Senate Watergate hearings, one of the testimony of a man named John Dean was the most explosive. John Dean told the Senate that he, in the Oval Office, had told the president that there was a, quote, cancer on the presidency, and that they discussed how they could cover up the Watergate break-in that was coming increasingly close to the White House, and that Nixon had agreed to participate in that cover-up. Well, the White House called him a liar. All you had was his word against the president and others until the tapes. But then it turned out it was all on tape, and everything that John Dean had said was actually true. There was no way then that Nixon could survive. But he didn't burn them. He did turn them over. He didn't pardon people to do anything like that for him. And the abuse of the pardon power, and now apparent immunization from prosecution enjoyed by the president, is something not foreseen by our founding fathers and not tested by prior presidents. So we're in a new era, and in these ways, not a good one, because our Constitution is a marvelous document that has served us very well. But when the checks and balances that it institutionalizes are broken down, our country comes closer to resembling other countries run at the whim and for the benefit of those in power. And now that can be true of presidents of either party. Pray for our country and those who comprise our government in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, that they will uphold our Constitution rather than undermine it, and thereby restrain the impulse to abuse of power, because power does corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you have any questions or a comment, you can send those to discern@cbctrenton.com. I hope you can listen again next Monday. In the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.